All right, is anyone wondering if that tall, skinny guy who just talked put on a fake beard so he could come out and talk again? I'm not Ryan. I would just wish I was. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to speak at a small Christian summer camp for families. And after I finished, this elderly couple shuffled forward. It was clear they had something they wanted to share. Their names were the Webbs. Mr. Webb was a retired Air Force pilot. They lived in Northern California. And they shared how several decades before, they had cared for a number of children in foster care. One of these boys was named Rick. Rick had come to them in his early teens. They knew he had had a very, very difficult life, that it would not be easy to bring new life to Rick. But they were convinced that their love and their tenderness and their patience and their prayers was going to change the trajectory of Rick's life. But it seemed like everything they did, Rick would just push back. And no matter how hard they would reach to them, he would just shove back harder. And if they tried to set any boundaries, he would get angry. And if they tried to give him a hug, he would say, "Hey, you just touch me. I know the rules. I'll report you, and they'll put you behind bars." In one Thanksgiving, Mrs. Webb made this great meal, and everything seemed to go well. They enjoyed this time together. And then right afterwards, Rick went out and he stole the neighbor's farm truck. And he took it for a joyride. He crashed it into a ditch. The police came and arrested him, took him to juvenile hall, and the social workers would not let Rick back into the Webb's home. And so for the rest of Rick's growing up years, he went back and forth between group homes and juvenile hall, group homes and juvenile hall. Finally, he aged out into adulthood, and the pattern continued. He was in and out of jail. Finally, under California's 3 strikes law, he was put behind bars for life. And this had happened several decades before, but the Webbs still had that look in their eye. I could still hear in their voice this deep, deep ache. They had such hopes for Rick, such confidence their love and prayers were going to change everything. And from where they stood, it just looked like failure. And my friends, as I think everyone in this room knows, this is not just the Webbs' story. I get to interact virtually every day with amazing men and women all over the United States, all over the world, who are pouring their lives out for vulnerable children and for families, their adoptive parents, their foster families, their mentors, their nonprofit leaders, their social workers. And virtually every single one of them has drunk deeply of that same kind of heartache. Because the truth is that anytime we choose to intervene, anytime we choose to open our lives and our hearts and perhaps our home to children and families that have known deep hurt, we will share in that hurt with them. There is joy too. Most certainly there is joy, but it almost always comes intertwined with pain. Joy and pain side by side. Several years ago, my family and I lived for a short time in Central America, and I remember one particular day spending time with a friend. He was the director of a children's home for children that had been seriously abused. And they also had a family reintegration program where they worked to bring children back into their biological family whenever that was possible. And as we walked through the courtyard of the children's home, he said to me, "That's Sabrina." And this girl with bright hair and bright, shining eyes just kind of danced past us almost. And she was just glowing. And my friend said, when she first came here, she was years behind developmentally and physically and intellectually. And she's doing so well now. And she had been afraid of just about everyone, especially men. And now she is just thriving. And it was just so clear to me, and her eyes were shining, and it was not just her. My friend's face shined when he talked about her. But not 10 minutes later, we were in my friend's office, and he told me about another girl who had been in the home, and they had been working to find family that they could reunify her with, but none of the scenarios seemed entirely safe. But then a judge stepped in and ordered that she be sent home immediately. And so she went to live with her biological father, who was not a good man. And several months later, she returned to the children's home, pregnant with a boy who would be both her son and her half-brother. And even as my friend said these words, I could still hear Sabrina out in the courtyard with the other girls laughing. And it was literally like the pain and the joy of the world were just colliding there side by side. Pain and joy intertwine. Let me make this more personal. My wife, Rachel, and I would tell you that adoption has been the greatest joy of our parenting life. And if you were interested, we would also tell you that it has brought many of the deepest struggles of our 19 years of marriage. We would say the same thing about foster care. And not only for ourselves, but for our 5 children as well. It has been some of the greatest delights. I think of a little boy named Louis who joined our family for 8 months. And all 5 of our kids just loved him and would care for him. And particularly the youngest of ours, who was 4 at the time, little Phoebe. And often we would put this little boy named Louis down in his crib and go out of the room. And then we'd hear on the baby monitor these weird sounds. And so I'd come back into the room, look, what's going on? And Phoebe would have crawled up into the crib and was sitting there with Louis singing to him. Oh, so much beauty. And we would pray for Louis as a family and pray for his mother. And my wife was mentoring Louis' mother. And I remember one night Phoebe praying, "Dear God, we want Louis to stay with us. But please help his mommy to get off drugs so he can go back to her." And that is how we all felt. We loved that little guy. And part of us just want him to stay with us forever. But we also yearned for his mother to get back to a place of health so that Louis could return to her. And when that day came, we celebrated. This is exactly what we had been praying for. And yet I still remember coming home after that and seeing that empty crib and just tears coming down my face. Joy and pain side by side. And I will tell you very transparently, there were some nights during the time when we were caring for Louis that it felt even deeper than that, because Louis had been born 2 months early and his digestive tract had not fully developed, and so he sometimes had a hard time keeping food down. I remember one particular night where I was sitting there holding him and feeding him a bottle. It was 2 a.m, and literally after about 25 minutes of feeding him, and I was just about to put him back into bed and then fall into bed myself, and he just spit up all over himself and trickled down all over me, and I had to change my clothes and change his clothes and make a new diaper and sit down and another 20 minutes feeding him, and I lifted him up and finally was putting him back in the crib a second time. One more time, all over again. And do you know what I said? What I wish I had done was sing, "Come thou fount of every blessing." But I didn't. The words that actually came out of my mouth were like this: "What's wrong with you, kid?" That's what I said. And then I sat there in the darkness, feeling deeply ashamed. And I felt anger. I felt anger at Louis' mom for sleeping while I was awake. And I felt anger at his dad because I knew that he had had at least 2 children with different women that year. And I felt angry with this precious, innocent little guy for spitting up all over himself and me. And I felt angry with myself that reservoir of love and goodness that I thought was just so big and strong in me proved to be utterly shallow. You see, when we're serving in this space, we don't just see the brokenness out there. We see it in here as well. The pain and the joy come side by side. And yet I think of another night too. Feeding Louis, my left arm was kind of crooked around him like this, and my right hand was just playing with his bare toes. And somehow that verse where Jesus says, "If you welcome little one in my name, you're welcoming me," that came to mind. And I just thought, hey, these are Jesus' toes. I'm getting to play with Jesus' toes. The pain and the joy side by side. See, I used to think of pain and joy as at opposite ends of a spectrum. You had pain way over here and joy way over here. And of course, if you see it that way, you want to get as far away from this side as possible and spend as much time over here as you possibly can. But what I've come to realize through all this is that most of the time, it's not pain over here and joy over here. It is the two intertwined side by side. And so the great choice in life is not whether we will find pain over here or joy over here. The great choice in life is whether we will embrace them both or we will try to avoid them both and settle for a safer and more comfortable but perhaps tepid life. I think the Apostle Paul understood this better than any. And he knew what he wanted. He wrote to the Philippians, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. Now, do you think Paul really wanted to suffer? I mean, I don't think so. He was human like us, right? But he understood somehow that knowing Christ and the power of his resurrection somehow came hand in hand with the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. And Paul decided that if it had to be both or neither, that he wanted both. That's the same choice that's before each of us as well. If this is true, if joy and pain really do come together, then what does that mean for a community like us? A community that is desiring to intervene, that desires to open our hearts and our homes and our lives to people who have known great hurt? Well, I believe it means quite a few things. Knowing that pain and joy come together certainly remind us that this is not a road to walk alone. We need each other. And knowing that pain and joy come together also reminds that we need a deeper motivation than duty or guilt or even idealism. Those things may have their place, but when the going gets tough, and it certainly will, they will run dry. We need a deeper source. We do not love because we are going to fix the world. We love because God first loved us. Knowing that pain and joy come together, it also reminds us that we are to speak the whole truth, not just part of it. Yes, we can tell of how adoption mirrors the beauty of the gospel story, but we also need to tell how adoption mirrors the costliness of the adoption story, the nails and the spears and the thorns. And we certainly need to believe and declare that God is doing amazing things, and yet we also can admit that often the results are far less than we had hoped for when we began. And yes, we can absolutely and must champion family restoration and preservation and reintegration. And yet we can also acknowledge that sometimes it is not safely possible. When we speak with this kind of authenticity, we can bear one another's burdens. When we speak with this kind of authenticity, we can engage the world as it really is, not as we wish it were. There's one final thing that I believe seeing how joy and pain intertwine teaches us. For me, this has been very personal over the last several years. I feel like God has been telling me, Jedd, what you need are rhythms of receiving. If you will take a deep breath with me just for a moment, breathe it in and out. See, breath is a rhythm. And our heartbeat is the same, right? It contracts and expands, contracts and expands. And if we stop in that rhythm, we will cease to thrive. We may cease to live. And I believe God has designed us, just as in this physical way, with these physical rhythms, to have spiritual rhythms as well, to build into each day time where we can receive from Him in space alone with Him. And to build into each week a day of Sabbath for rest and worship and play. and to build into each year times of solitude where we are alone and away from all the noise so that we can be present with God in His still small voice. These are not requirements. This is not law. But these are simply ways in which we can open our hands and receive so that as we're pouring out, that God can continually fill what has spilled. We need these rhythms of receiving if we are to persist in the pain and the joy side by side. Well, you remember that boy Rick that I mentioned in the Webbs? The Webbs stayed with him. They continued to write him letters in prison. They would visit him. They sent gifts on his birthday and at Christmas. And at first he would actually say, he'd write back and say, don't give me those Christian books. I'm never going to read them. But over time, he began to soften. And several years ago, they had a conversation when the Webbs were visiting. He said, I had so many different people in my life, social workers and parole officers and group home administrators. Not one of them stayed in contact with me except you guys. And more recently, he has begun addressing his letters back to them in a new way. Now the letters begin, Dear Mom and Dad. Now, is that success or is that failure? Sometimes that's hard to tell this side of heaven. But what we can know for certain is that God cares deeply and personally for every Rick, and for every Sabrina, and for every Louie and Louie's mom. We can also know for certain that if we choose to open our lives and our homes and our hearts and intervene, we will share in their pain with them, both the joy and the pain intertwined. But we can also be sure that if we choose to follow Christ to the hurting places of the world, we will someday stand before our Heavenly Father. And we will hear those words that every son and daughter long to hear. Well done, good and faithful child. Enter into the joy of your Maker. And eternity will stretch before us like a vast panorama. And He will wipe every tear from our eyes and destroy every hurt. And yet somehow, I suspect that the pain of now will be part of what makes that day so sweet.